Have you ever heard of a battle won not by swords, but by shovels? Historians call it the greatest siege of antiquity, but in reality, it was the most massive, cynical, and terrifying experiment on the human psyche in the history of the ancient world. Imagine Rome's greatest commander voluntarily driving himself and his legions into a death trap. He found himself pinned in a narrow corridor. On one side, 80,000 furious defenders of a fortress, and on the other, a living ocean of 250,000 barbarians thirsting for his blood. Chances of survival, 0. In this video, we will uncover the dark underbelly of Roman glory that school textbooks are silent about. You will learn why Julius Caesar, that idol of civilization, issued an order that condemned thousands of women and children to an agonizing death in no man's land, right before the eyes of their fathers and husbands. We will tell you to what monstrous limits the besieged were pushed when the city ran out of provisions, and why legionaries became millionaires, selling not goods, but living human beings. This is not a story about heroism. It is a story of how brilliant engineering turned into a machine for grinding up people, and how the Roman Republic died in the mud and blood of Alesia to make way for a ruthless empire. Ready to see what a human being is actually capable of when backed into a corner? Then watch until the end. The truth will shock you. Imagine a sound more terrifying than a battle cry. It is not the clash of swords or the whistle of arrows. It is a dull, rhythmic thud. Thump. Thump. The sound of metal striking dry, rocky earth. Tens of thousands of shovels and pickaxes rising and falling in perfect, deadly unison. If you close your eyes, you can smell the dust hanging in the air, mixed with the acrid sweat of legionaries moving tons of soil. You're in the very center of Gaul, and right now, before your eyes, history is changing course. Here, amidst the hills and rivers, the old world of lone heroes is dying, and the ruthless, mathematically precise machine of the empire is being born. By the end of September 52 BC, when the nights turned cold and breath came out in white clouds of steam, Gaius Julius Caesar did something no one expected. He stopped. Before him rose the plateau of Alesia, a giant natural fortress towering over the plain. On its summit, behind stone walls, the flower of the Gallic nation had gathered. 80,000 warriors. 80,000 furious, proud men, ready to die for freedom. They were led by Vercingetorix, the man who had almost managed to break Rome's back. Look at him. He stands on the wall, the wind tearing at his hair. He is young, charismatic, and dangerous. He is the one who united the scattered tribes, who forced them to forget old grievances for the sake of one goal: to throw the Romans out. For months, he waged a war that we would today call scorched earth tactics. He burned his own villages, destroyed grain supplies, and condemned his people to starvation, just to deprive the legions of provisions. He was a ghost, striking and vanishing into the forests. He defeated Caesar at Gergovia. He made the Roman eagle bleed. But now he had made a fatal, unforgivable mistake. Intoxicated by success, Vercingetorix stopped running. He decided to fight. He chose Alesia as the arena for his triumph. He thought he was luring Caesar into a trap. After all, storming such a height is suicide. The slopes are steep, the walls are high, and 80,000 defenders are a force to be reckoned with. The Gallic chieftain expected the Romans to throw themselves at the walls like rabid dogs and bash their heads against the stone. He expected a heroic battle, where personal valor decides the outcome. He expected a war in the style of the Iliad. But Caesar was not an epic hero. He was a pragmatist, a cold, cynical engineer of death. Look into his eyes. There is no thirst for glory in them, only calculation. He looks at Alesia not as a fortress, but as a problem requiring a solution. He sees numbers. He sees logistics. He understands, if the enemy cannot be killed with a sword, he must be strangled. Instead of the order, "Charge!" the legions receive a different command. Pick up shovels. The Roman army instantly transforms. They are no longer warriors. They are the largest construction corporation in the ancient world. Caesar decides to build a wall, but not a simple wall. He decides to encircle the entire mountain, the entire city, all these 80,000 people, with a giant ring of fortifications. The length of this line is 11 miles. 11 miles of back-breaking labor. Do you understand the irony? The Gauls locked themselves in a fortress to protect themselves, but Caesar does not intend to drive them out. Imagine standing on the wall and watching your world, your horizon, slowly but surely being blocked off by a wall of Roman pila and palisades. You watch as the landscape you have known since childhood turns into an alien, hostile geometry. The Romans were not just building a wall. They were building a killing machine. They were turning nature itself into a weapon against the Gauls. Caesar wrote in his commentaries, dryly and matter-of-factly, as if talking about repairing an aqueduct, "It was decided to erect fortifications to deprive the enemy of hope of escape." Deprive of hope. Think about those words. This is not a military tactic. It is a death sentence. He didn't want to defeat them in battle. He wanted to grind them into dust, humiliate them, show that any resistance to Rome is not heroism, but stupidity, punishable by death. Vercingetorix realized what was happening too late. His cavalry tried to interfere with the work, launching furious sorties, but the Roman machine worked without fail. Legionaries held a shield with one hand and dug with the other. The skirmishes were brutal, short, and bloody. The Gallic cavalry, the pride of the tribes, shattered against the iron discipline of the legions and rolled back into the fortress, leaving bodies in the freshly dug trenches. Every meter of excavated earth brought the inevitable closer. The ring closed. Alesia was cut off from the world. No grain, no reinforcements, no news. 80,000 warriors and tens of thousands of civilians, the population of the city of the Mandubii, found themselves in a stone sack. The air inside the fortress began to grow heavy with the premonition of disaster. And outside, under the gray autumn sky, the Romans continued to dig. They were not just building a wall. They were biting into the earth, preparing graves for those who were still alive, turning the fields around Alesia into the most complex and deadly labyrinth in human history. You look at these fields and see simply dug-up earth, right? But for a Gaul who risked coming down from his hill, this was not earth. It was an obstacle course designed by a sadist with an engineering degree. Caesar understood. He had only 50,000 men against a giant horde inside and an unknown threat outside. He could not afford a fair wall-on-wall fight. He needed an equalizer, and he turned engineering into an architecture of nightmares. The first circle of this hell was the trenches, not just ditches, but giant scars on the body of Gaul. The first trench, 20 feet wide, with vertical walls. Imagine running up to it in the heat of an attack, and before you is a vertical drop. You can't climb down without breaking your legs. You can't jump over. You stop, and at that moment a Roman javelin pierces your chest. But that was only the beginning. Behind the first trench lay a second one, filled with water. The Romans diverted local rivers, forcing the water itself to work for them. This is no longer war. This is terraforming for the sake of murder. Behind the trenches rose an earthen rampart 12 feet high. On it were a palisade and towers spaced every 80 feet. But Caesar, that paranoid man calculating everything 10 moves ahead, knew even this was not enough. If the Gauls surged with their entire mass, they would fill the trenches with their own bodies and climb over the wall on the corpses of their comrades. They had to be stopped earlier. Their will and legs had to be broken before they even touched the Roman wall. And then the legionaries began to create what they, with grim army humor, called the garden. Before the trenches, they dug 5 rows of other ditches. Into them they buried thick tree trunks, the branches of which were sharpened and intertwined. They stuck out of the ground like the antlers of a monstrous deer. The Romans called them cipi, grave markers. Try to break through this windbreak. You can't chop it, the branches spring back. You can't crawl through, the sharp points tear clothes and skin. You get stuck, becoming a perfect target for the archers on the walls. But if you, miraculously surviving, managed to tear through the grave markers, the next surprise awaited you. Lilies. Sounds beautiful, right? The Romans named them for their resemblance to the shape of the flower, but it was the beauty of death. 8 rows of conical pits, 3 feet deep. At the bottom of each was a stake as thick as a thigh, hardened by fire and sharp as a needle. The stake didn't stick out. It was hidden in the depths, and the pit itself was masked with brushwood and grass. Imagine the moment. You are running into the attack, grass under your feet. You take a step, and the ground gives way. You fall with all your weight into the pit. The sharp stake enters your foot, pierces the bone, and exits through the shin. Or, if you're unlucky, it rips open your groin. You are impaled like an insect on a pin. You cannot get out yourself. The stake is driven firmly into the ground. You scream. Your comrades running behind trip over you and also fall into neighboring pits. The attack chokes in blood and screams. It was a brilliant and monstrous economy of effort. A Roman soldier didn't even need to lift his sword to kill an enemy. The earth did it for him. And for those lucky ones who passed both the cipi and the lilies, the last invention of the Roman gloomy genius was hiding in the grass. Stimuli. Iron hooks, barbed like fishing tackle, driven into short wooden blocks and completely hidden in the sod. These were ancient anti-personnel mines. Stepping on such a hook, a man fell, tearing his foot to shreds. Any movement only drove the iron deeper into the flesh. The field before the walls turned into a carpet of hidden blades. Legionaries built this day and night. Look at their hands. Calloused, dirty, accustomed to the shaft of a shovel more than the hilt of a sword. They felled timber, hauled logs, dug clay. It was a conveyor belt, an industrial approach to destruction. No romance, no warrior's honor. Only cold calculation. The density of stakes per square meter, the depth of the pit, the angle of sharpening. The enemy must die without even seeing the face of his killer. The Gauls from the walls of Alesia watched as this zone of death grew around them. At first, they probably didn't understand exactly what the Romans were doing in the tall grass. But when the first scouts didn't return, or returned crawling on their hands with torn legs, terror began to seep into their hearts. They realized they were locked in not just by a wall. They were surrounded by a mechanical meat grinder waiting for meat to be thrown into it. However, Caesar didn't have time to admire his work. Intelligence brought news that would make any other commander's blood run cold. Vercingetorix's plan had worked, albeit belatedly. Messengers had broken through the blockade before the ring closed. All of Gaul had risen. Marching toward Alesia was not just an army. A living sea was marching toward Alesia. 250,000 warriors. 250,000 enraged Gauls thirsting for Roman blood. The mathematics of war suddenly became fatal for Rome. 50,000 legionaries against 80,000 inside the fortress, and 250,000 outside. 330,000 against 50,000. A ratio of 6 to 1. Any tactics textbook will tell you, run. Lift the siege, abandon the baggage train, and leave before you are crushed. But Caesar, standing over a map in his tent by the light of an oil lamp, makes a decision bordering on insanity. He does not leave. He orders the shovels turned around. If one wall is not enough, we will build a second one. Legionaries, barely having finished the hellish labor on the inner line, receive a new order. Dig behind your backs. Caesar decides to build a contravallation line, an outer ring of fortifications facing outward against the relief army. He locks himself and his men in a narrow corridor between two walls. Imagine a donut. In the donut hole is Vercingetorix. Outside is all of Gaul. And the Roman army is the dough itself. A narrow strip of land exposed to fire from both sides. It was an all-in gamble. The stake was bigger than life, bigger than reputation. At stake was the existence of the Roman army. The soldiers understood. There was nowhere to retreat. The walls they were building became their prison and their only protection. They dug with doubled fury because they knew they were digging either fortifications or their own mass grave. Dust was already rising on the horizon from the hundreds of thousands of feet of the Liberation Army, and the race against time began. Would they manage to close the outer perimeter before the hammer struck the anvil? Heavy electric tension hung in the air. The greatest trap in history had slammed shut, but inside it were not just the Gauls. Inside was Caesar himself. Have you ever felt the walls of a room start to close in? Real claustrophobia is not when you get stuck in an elevator. It is when you stand in a field, under the open sky, but you can't get enough air because you know there is no way out. That is the feeling that settled in the hearts of 50,000 Roman legionaries when they closed the second ring of fortifications. Caesar created an architectural paradox. He built a prison inside out. The inner wall kept the beast in the cage, Vercingetorix. The outer wall, 14 miles long, was supposed to hold back the ocean of rage rolling in from the depths of Gaul. And between these walls, in a narrow strip of dug-up earth, squeezed like grain between millstones, lived, slept, and ate the Romans. Imagine this corridor. It is not just a military camp. It is an elongated, curved city of leather tents, smoke from campfires, and the smell of unwashed bodies. The width of this life zone in places did not exceed a couple of 100 meters. On one side, 80,000 enemies looking at you from the walls of Alesia. On the other, an invisible but approaching armada of 250,000 people. And you are in the middle. You are the filling in a deadly pie. The psychological pressure in this corridor was monstrous. Legionaries are superstitious people. They were used to going forward, conquering, seeing the horizon before them. Here, they dug the earth as if preparing a collective grave for themselves. Every strike of the pickaxe echoed in the brain with the question, Are we building protection or nailing down the lid of our own coffin? Rumors crawled through the camp faster than lice. They said there were so many Gauls coming that they would drink the rivers dry. They said Caesar had lost his mind. But discipline, beaten in by the centurion's rods, held this fear in check. For now. Caesar understood time was working against him. He needed not just to build walls, he needed to stock up on resources. Before the outer ring closed, Roman cavalry scoured the surroundings like a swarm of locusts. They swept up everything: grain, livestock, forage. They left a desert around Alesia so that the oncoming Gallic army would have nothing to eat. It was scorched earth tactics applied with surgical precision. The Romans dragged mountains of provisions into their corridor, realizing that the next delivery of food could come only after victory. Or never. The outer line of fortifications, called the circumvallation, became a mirror image of the inner one. The same trenches, the same wolf pits, the same iron hooks hidden in the grass. The Romans mined the approaches to themselves from both sides. They turned into a hedgehog bristling with needles in all directions. No one could enter, no one could leave. It was isolation of an absolute level. No letters to Rome, no news from the Senate. 50,000 men remained alone at the edge of the world, relying only on their engineering genius and the luck of their commander. Caesar rode along the rising walls, his red cloak flashing here and there. He joked with the soldiers, checked the quality of the stakes, radiated confidence. He played a role. He knew that if he showed even a shadow of doubt, the army would collapse before the battle even began. He sold them the idea of their invulnerability, while he calculated the variance of catastrophe. And inside the ring, in Alesia itself, the mood changed from euphoria to anxiety. At first, the Gauls saw the construction of the outer wall as a sign of Roman fear. "Look, they are afraid of our brothers! They are hiding!" shouted the chiefs. But when the wall grew, when the horizon disappeared behind the palisade, realization came. The Romans hadn't run away. They had dug in. And now the help Vercingetorix had hoped for so much would not just have to defeat the Romans in the field, but storm a fortified fort. Vercingetorix, standing on a high rock, saw the trap snap shut. He saw the last gap in the outer ring being filled with earth and blocked with logs. Now they were completely cut off. Silence descended on the valley. A terrible, cotton-like silence of waiting. The knocking of axes ceased. Only the wind remained, wandering between the two walls, and the cawing of crows sensing a feast. In this enclosed space, where time seemed to have stopped, another timer began to tick. A biological one. There were 80,000 soldiers in Alesia, plus the population of the city, the Mandubii tribe, plus thousands of horses. They all wanted to eat. The supplies gathered by Vercingetorix were huge, but not infinite. When the Romans cut off the last stream and the last path, the arithmetic of survival became simple and cruel. Food began to disappear. First, they reduced the rations for the horses. Then, they started slaughtering livestock. Then, they cut the warriors' portions. Grain became more expensive than gold. Inside the fortress, behind proud walls, a scenario began to unfold that spares neither heroes nor cowards. Hunger is an enemy you cannot stab with a sword. It kills slowly, humiliatingly, turning people into shadows. And while the Romans, in their corridor of death, sharpened their pila and peered into the horizon awaiting an attack, inside Alesia, the enemy had already entered the gates. Not a Roman legionary, but an emptiness in the stomach, that would very soon force people to do the unthinkable. Hunger doesn't come all at once. First, it is just an annoying rumbling in the belly that can be drowned out with water or sleep. But after a week, that rumbling turns into a beast gnawing you from the inside. After 30 days of siege, Alesia ceased to be a fortress and turned into a morgue for the still living. Grain reserves that seemed endless evaporated. Try to imagine the menu of the defenders of freedom. First, they ate the sheep and goats. Then came the turn of the war horses. It was a terrible blow to morale. A Gaul without a horse is no longer a rider, but just an infantryman. But meat is meat. When the horses ran out, dogs went into use. And then the real diet of despair began. People boiled leather straps, shields covered in ox hide, chewed tree bark. In the dark corners of longhouses, they whispered about things it was scary to speak of aloud. About the taste of human flesh. About how the dead no longer need food, but the living need it to hold a sword. Vercingetorix convened a council. The situation was not just critical, it was mathematically unsolvable. There were too many eaters, too little food. And then a decision was made that even 2,000 years later radiates a grave cold. It was the logic of a butcher sorting cattle. The chiefs decided to get rid of the ballast, of those who could not hold a weapon, of the useless mouths. The Mandubii tribe, the native inhabitants of the city who had let Vercingetorix's army in, given them shelter and protection, suddenly learned the price of this friendship. They were asked to leave. Women, old men, children, cripples, thousands of people. They were driven out of their own homes, pushed in the back with spears toward the city gates. Can you imagine this scene? The gates open, and a river of human grief pours out of them. They did not resist. Hope even glimmered in their eyes. Naive, foolish hope. They thought, the Romans are civilized people. They don't fight women. They will take us into slavery. Slavery is bad, but slaves are fed. They walked toward the Roman fortifications, begging for chains. If only a crust of bread came with the chains. They approached the first trench, to that very death zone studded with stakes, and they stopped. On the rampart stood legionaries, iron statues whose faces expressed nothing but fatigue and weariness. The refugees held out their hands, showed emaciated children, shouted in broken Latin, "Take us! We will work! Just give us food!" A messenger raced to Caesar's tent. And here we see the true face of the proconsul. Not the face of a politician from the Forum, but the face of war. Caesar listened to the report. He had a choice. Let them through? That means feeding thousands of enemies with his own supplies, of which the Romans themselves had barely enough. Or let them through the lines to freedom? But then they would tell the reinforcements about the weak spots in the defense. Caesar gave an order. One short word. No. Let no one pass. Neither into captivity, nor to freedom. The legionaries on the walls received the order to raise their shields. When the women tried to get closer to the rampart, Pila struck the ground before their feet. It was a line. A step across it meant death. The Mandubii rushed back in terror to the gates of Alesia, but the gates were closed. Looking down at them from the walls were their husbands, fathers, and brothers, and they didn't open them either. Vercingetorix couldn't let them back in. He had driven them out to save food. Taking them back meant condemning the army to starvation death several days sooner. And they remained there, in the neutral zone, in a narrow strip of no man's land between the Gallic wall and the Roman trench, under the open sky, without food, without water, without hope. This was perhaps the most monstrous experiment in the history of ancient psychology. Imagine this theater of horror. Warriors stand on the walls of Alesia and look down, where their wives and children are slowly dying of hunger and thirst. They hear their screams day and night. "Papa, help! Water!" And opposite, 100 meters away, Romans sit in trenches. They see it too. They hear it too. They eat their rations to the accompaniment of children's crying. Days went by. The screams became quieter. The people below turned into skeletons covered in skin. They crawled through the mud, tearing up grass, trying to drink their own urine. Who was the greater beast here? The Gauls who sacrificed their families for the sake of war? Or the Romans who cold-bloodedly watched this agony, using it as a weapon of psychological pressure? Caesar wanted to break the spirit of the defenders. He wanted to show them, this is what awaits you. This is the price of your resistance. Watch your loved ones die and know you did this to them yourselves. In the end, the screams died down. The neutral zone turned into a field of corpses. The stench of decay covered both armies. It was an absolute, ringing silence of moral collapse. It seemed there was nowhere lower to fall. It seemed there was no room left for action in this hell, only for slow rotting. But the silence was torn by a sound. At first it sounded like distant thunder, though the sky was clear. The ground under the feet of the legionaries standing on the outer wall trembled slightly. The tremor grew into a vibration. The vibration into a hum. The Romans turned their heads to the west, away from the rotting bodies in the trenches, to where the sun was setting behind the hills. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, covering half the sky. These were not clouds. It was Gaul coming. 250,000 people. The hammer was raised. Have you ever seen what 250,000 people look like? Probably not. Even the biggest modern stadiums hold fewer. Imagine the population of an average city, but every man in that city is armed with a spear, a sword, and hatred. That is exactly what the Roman sentries saw at sunset. The horizon ceased to be a line separating sky and earth. It turned into a living, moving mass. This was not an army in the Roman sense, with even squares of cohorts. It was a human ocean. Gallic tribes from all corners of the country, Arverni, Aedui, Sequani, had forgotten their feuds to wash the Roman infection from the face of the earth. When this armada approached the walls, they let out a cry. Ancient historians write that birds fell from the sky from that roar. Perhaps it is an exaggeration, but the legionaries in the trenches felt their own bones vibrate. It was the sound of absolute animal confidence. The Gauls knew there were 5 times more of them than Romans. They saw before them a thin line of earthen ramparts and laughed. What is 12 feet of earth against the fury of a whole people? But the real hell began not during the day. The Gauls, driven by a thirst for revenge, did not wait for dawn. They chose the time when fear has the biggest eyes. Midnight. Imagine this scene. Darkness. Pitch black. You are a legionary. You are standing on the outer wall. Your hands are shaking with tension, gripping the shaft of a pilum. Behind, at your back, you hear movement. It is Vercingetorix, hearing the signal of his brothers, opening the fortress gates and throwing his hungry, desperate warriors at the inner wall. You are trapped. You are the filling in a sandwich that is about to be chewed from 2 sides. The attack began not with the clash of swords, but with a sound. the whistle of thousands of sling stones and arrows flying out of the darkness. They drummed against shields like hail on a tin roof, knocked people off their feet, broke bones. And then a wave emerged from the gloom. The Gauls rushed to the assault, running, with wild screams, counting on crushing the Romans with one blow. But they forgot who was waiting for them. They forgot about Caesar's engineers. In the darkness, the death zone, which the Romans had been building so carefully for weeks, worked at full capacity. It was a slaughter in the blind. The Gauls didn't see the trenches. They didn't see the wolf pits. The front rows of attackers flew at full run into the Lilies, camouflaged pits with stakes. Listen. Do you hear that sound? It is not the snapping of twigs, it is the sound of breaking shins and tearing ligaments. The first row collapsed, pierced by hidden spikes. Those running behind tripped over screaming comrades, writhing in agony, and fell onto the same stakes, impaling themselves as a second, third layer. The stimuli, those same fishing hooks in the grass, bit into souls, turning every step into torture. The darkness filled with a cacophony of terror. Battle cries were replaced by screams of pain that made blood run cold, even in veterans. But the wave did not stop. The back rows, not seeing what was happening in front, pushed the front ones. It was a conveyor belt of death. The Gauls paved the road to the Roman wall with their own bodies. They filled the trenches with corpses and the wounded to walk over them as if over a bridge. And on the ramparts, the Roman machine worked. Without emotions, without pity, legionaries acted like automatons. Throw pilum, take the next one. Throw, shield bash, gladius strike. They fought back to back in the literal sense of the word. Some cohorts fought off the outer army. Others turned 180 degrees to hold back the onslaught of Vercingetorix, who was trying to break out from inside. Torchlight snatched faces distorted by fury from the darkness. Gauls trying to climb the rampart, clinging to the palisade, to shields, to sword blades. Romans threw them down, stabbed faces, chopped hands. The heavy, nauseating smell of fresh blood mixed with the burning of pitch hung in the air. It was a night of chaos. Commanders lost their voices trying to shout over the noise of the battle. Centurions ran along the line, plugging breaches with their own bodies. It seemed there was no end to this horde. As soon as one Gaul fell, two took his place. The Roman line of defense stretched like a string. It rang with tension. In some places, enemies had already climbed the wall, and the battle turned into a cruel melee in the mud, where knives, stones, and even teeth were used. But Caesar's engineering calculation took the blow. Those very trenches the Gauls had laughed at now became their curse. They slowed the tempo of the attack, broke the monolithic wave into separate trickles that the legionaries could handle. The Romans did not win by muscle strength. They won with geometry. The angle of the trench slope, the height of the rampart, the density of stakes, all these dry numbers that night converted into thousands of killed enemies. When dawn finally broke, the battlefield presented a picture from the apocalypse. The ground before the walls had disappeared. It was completely covered with bodies. In the wolf pits and trenches, the dead lay in heaps, mixed with the still living who could not get out from under the pile of bodies. The Gauls rolled back, stunned, bled dry, but not broken. The Romans stood on their walls, black with soot, drenched in alien blood, breathing heavily. They had held out, but every one of them, looking at the endless sea of enemies preparing for a new attack, asked himself the same question. How long will we last? After all, this was only the first night, and the Gauls were only testing the ground. The real storm was still ahead. You think the Roman machine was perfect. You think Caesar's genius could foresee every stone and every bush. You are mistaken. Any plan, even the most perfect one, has a crack. And the Gauls, having washed their wounds after the night slaughter, found this crack. They understood a simple thing. You cannot break a wall with your forehead, even if you have 250,000 foreheads. The Roman meat grinders worked flawlessly. But Caesar's engineering genius had one enemy he couldn't defeat: geography. On the northern side of the perimeter rose a hill, Mount Rhea. It was too huge to include in the ring of fortifications. Then the defense line would have stretched to impossible lengths. And it was too steep to build a wall directly on its slope. Caesar had to do what any strategist hates: compromise. He laid the line of fortifications at the foot of the hill, in a disadvantageous position. The Romans stood here in the lowlands, and the enemy could look down on them. This was the Achilles' heel, a hole in the armor, and Gallic scouts crawling in the grass under the noses of legionaries saw it. In the Gallic camp, there were no more drunken yells and chaotic attacks. The chiefs gathered for a council. They unrolled a map drawn on a hide and poked a finger at the northern slope. "Right here," they said. "Here we will crack the Roman turtle." For this mission, the best were selected. No militia, no peasants with pitchforks. This was the elite. 60,000 select warriors. 60,000 professional killers, veterans of many battles. To command them, they appointed Vercassivellaunus, a cousin of Vercingetorix himself. This was not just a commander. This was a man obsessed with saving his relative and destroying Rome. Look at that number. 60,000. That is more than Caesar's entire army locked in the ring. And all this monstrous power was to strike at a single point, not scatter around the perimeter, not seek luck everywhere, but work like a battering ram. One blow, and the wall will collapse. They moved out at night, quietly, without torches, without battle songs. 60,000 men went around the hill from the rear and hid in the ravines, waiting for noon. Can you imagine the discipline needed to hide such an army? It was like a compressed spring, ready to uncoil and sweep away everything in its path. And down below, in the Roman camp, the two legions guarding this sector felt something was wrong. Soldiers are intuitive creatures. They looked at the slope of Mount Rhea hanging over them and felt naked. The walls here were lower, the trenches narrower. The geometry of death failed here. The legionaries understood. If a blow comes, it will be here. The sun rose to its zenith. Heat began to flood the valley, making the air shimmer over the dug-up earth. And suddenly, the hill came alive. First, banners appeared, then spear tips flashed, and then the slope of Mount Rhea turned into an avalanche. 60,000 throats let out a single scream, and this living mass rushed down. It didn't look like the night attack. It was worse. At night, there was chaos. Here was cold, tactical inevitability. The Gauls ran down the slope, gaining momentum. Physics was on their side. They didn't just run, they crashed onto the Roman positions with the force of a rock fall. Simultaneously, as if by an invisible signal, Vercingetorix struck from the gates of Alesia. He saw his cousin's maneuver. He understood the plan. The hammer on the outside, the anvil on the inside. He threw everything he had left at the same section of the wall, only from the inner side. The Romans found themselves in hell. The vice began to close. On one side, 60,000 fresh warriors of Vercassivellaunus full of strength flew at them, showering them with a hail of javelins from top to bottom. On the other, desperate, hungry, but no less dangerous warriors of Vercingetorix tore at the inner fortifications with their teeth. The defenders of the northern sector realized this was the end. There were too few of them. No matter how brave they were, you can't cheat math. The Gauls filled the trenches with fascines, bundles of brushwood, and earth. They walked over corpses, over wood, over earth, ignoring losses. They tore down towers, ripped out stakes with their bare hands. Gaius Antistius Reginus and Gaius Caninius Rebellus, commanders of these two legions, sent messenger after messenger to Caesar. "We won't hold them! We are being crushed! Need help!" Panic sounded in their voices. They saw the defense line cracking and bending. They saw Gallic swords starting to cut clearings in the ranks of legionaries. Caesar, located at an observation point, saw everything. He saw the northern sector turning into a bloody mess. He saw his perfect geometric trap breaking under the brute force of a barbarian battering ram. For the first time in the entire campaign, a shadow of fear appeared on the proconsul's face. He understood. This is not just an attack. This is checkmate in 2 moves. If the Gauls break through here, they will get behind the other legions. The entire army will be destroyed in an hour. The corridor of death will become a grave for Rome. The crisis had arrived. The time for engineering tricks was over. The time had come for brute slaughter, where only one thing decided: who blinks first. Look at the northern slope. There are no more tactics there. There is no formation. There is only primal chaos, where iron grinds against iron and men turn into beasts. Caesar's defense, that seemingly indestructible wall, began to crack. Do you hear that sound? It is not the cracking of wood. It is the sound of the Roman army's spine breaking. The attack was perfectly synchronized. Like 2 giant pistons, the armies of the Gauls struck simultaneously. Outside pressed the horde of Vercassivellaunus, rolling down the slope of Mount Rhea like a mud flow. From the inside, sensing the proximity of freedom, Vercingetorix's warriors bit into the fortifications. The Romans in this sector found themselves in the position of a man being crushed by 2 shields. The walls that were supposed to protect them suddenly became too low. The trenches that were supposed to stop the enemy disappeared. They were filled with earth, logs, and bodies so quickly that the legionaries didn't even have time to realize how the death zone turned into a smooth highway for the stormers. The Romans ran out of everything. They ran out of pila, those heavy javelins that were their main trump card at a distance. Legionaries had thrown them for hours, but there were more enemies than projectiles. Strength ran out. These men hadn't slept properly for several days. Their muscles were clogged with lactic acid, their arms heavy as lead. Lifting a shield was a feat. Striking with a sword was a superhuman task. And the Gauls kept coming and coming. Fresh, rested, full of furious energy. They replaced each other like shifts at a factory, while the Romans were chained to their places, unable even to wipe the sweat from their eyes that was flooding their vision. The defense began to tear. In several places, the Gauls, using numerical superiority, climbed onto the rampart. They didn't just climb up. They began to tear down the fortifications. With hooks and ropes, they pulled apart the woven palisade, collapsed the earthen mounds. Roman fortification, that masterpiece of engineering thought, was being destroyed by hand. Gauls burst into the breaches like water into a ship's punctured hold. Massacre began inside the perimeter. The battle disintegrated into hundreds of personal duels. The formation crumbled. Centurions, wheezing from shouting, tried to pull men into turtles, but the onslaught was too strong. The legionaries retreated. Slowly, step by step, snapping back with gladius strikes, they backed away. But there was nowhere to back away to. Behind was the inner wall, which was also being stormed. The corridor of death was shrinking. It was at this moment that the most terrible poison began to seep into the soul of the Iron Legions. Panic. It was not the squeal of a coward. It was the cold, sticky realization of the end. Veterans who had marched with Caesar through all of Gaul looked at each other and saw the same question in their comrades' eyes. Is this really it? Will we really die here, in the mud, crushed by a crowd? They saw their unsinkable ship sinking. Titus Labienus, Caesar's deputy commanding this sector, sent messengers one after another. His reports became shorter and more terrible. Holding on with last strength. Breakthrough on the left flank. No reserves. He threw everything he had into battle. He pulled cohorts from other, quieter sectors, bearing the perimeter, risking everything. 39 cohorts. Imagine this mass of people running inside the corridor, stumbling, trying to plug a hole in a dam that had already burst. But even this was not enough. The Gauls smelled blood. They saw the Romans waver. Their shouts became louder, their blows more vicious. Chiefs on the front line screamed to their warriors, "Look! They are running! Rome is falling!" It was ecstasy. The moment for which they had endured hunger and humiliation. They already saw themselves as victors, standing on a pile of Roman armor. Vercassivelaunus drove his men forward, disregarding losses. He didn't need tactics. He needed a breakthrough. He just needed to lean with mass and smother the legions. The situation reached a boiling point. The Roman defense line on the northern slope turned into a thin, bleeding film, ready to burst at any touch. The Gauls were already inside the fortifications. They were already cutting legionaries on their own territory. The dust was so thick the sun couldn't be seen. It seemed twilight had come. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the heavy metallic smell of blood. It was chaos in its pure form. If you looked at the battlefield from above, with the eyes of a bird or the gods, you would see a terrible picture. A giant ring of fortifications looking like a snake biting its own tail. And in one place, in the north, the body of this snake was being torn apart by thousands of ants. Roman order, Roman discipline, Roman pride. All this was being ground into dust under the feet of barbarians. Minutes remained until total defeat. The fate of the entire campaign, the fate of Caesar, the fate of Rome's future hung by a thread that was about to snap. And at that moment, when hope had already died and fear paralyzed the will, a figure had to appear on the stage capable of changing the laws of the physics of war. Sometimes history depends not on the movement of whole peoples, but on the decision of one man. At that moment, when the northern defense sector turned into a meat grinder, and Titus Labienus's legions were ready to break under the weight of 60,000 Gauls, Gaius Julius Caesar realized strategy was gone. Tactics were over. Only psychology remained. He stood on an elevation and saw his life's work collapsing. If the breakthrough wasn't plugged now, in an hour his head would adorn a barbarian's spear, and the Roman Republic would shudder with horror. He had no fresh legions. He had no hidden reserves. He had only himself. And then Caesar did what distinguishes a great commander from just a good general. He decided to become a target. He put on his famous commander's cloak over his armor, the paludamentum, bright purple, the color of fresh, thick blood. In the dust and grayness of battle, where everything is covered in mud, this cloak shone like a beacon. It was an insane risk. He consciously turned himself into the most visible figure on the battlefield. He said to every enemy archer, every slinger, "I am here. Kill me if you can." But this signal was intended not only for enemies. It was needed by his soldiers. Legionaries dying in the mud had to see their leader is not hiding in the rear. He is going into hell with them. Caesar gathered everything he could scrape up. 13 cohorts, battered, tired, pulled from other sectors, and the remnants of the cavalry. A handful of riders against an ocean of infantry. With these pitiful forces, he committed a suicidal maneuver. Instead of plugging the hole from the inside, he ordered the gates in the outer wall opened and went outside. Do you understand the madness of this step? He left the protection of the fortifications. He led his tiny detachment into the open field, straight into the rear of Vercassivalonis's attacking horde. It was the gambit of a gambler betting everything holding only a pair of deuces. Imagine this moment through the eyes of a Gallic warrior. You are storming a wall. You feel the taste of victory. The Romans are weakening. One more effort and you break through. And suddenly, behind your back, a trumpet sounds. You turn around and see not reinforcements. You see riders charging at you at a gallop. And leading them is a figure in a fluttering purple cloak. Caesar. The name used to scare children in Gallic villages. The demon who burned their cities and sold their brothers into slavery. He was here. Not behind a wall, but right at your back. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. It was an electric shock. Logic told the Gauls, there are few of them, crush them. But fear screamed, it's a trap. If Caesar went out into the field, it means he has a force we don't know about. It means new legions are approaching now. Caesar bet on shock. The cavalry crashed into the flank and rear of the Gallic army with the fury of the doomed. Riders chopped left and right, creating the appearance of a huge army. The purple cloak darted in the thickest of the fray. Caesar didn't just command. He inspired with his presence, turning every Roman soldier into a berserker. And on the walls, a miracle happened. Labienus's legionaries, who a minute ago were preparing to die, saw their commander in the enemy rear. Fatigue vanished. Pain went away. They were seized by euphoria bordering on madness. "The Imperator is with us!" This cry swept through the ranks. They stopped backing away. They threw their pila, the last ones they had, and with drawn swords jumped from the walls straight onto the heads of the storming Gauls. The situation flipped in seconds. Now the Gauls found themselves in a vice. From the front, Labienus's legionaries, risen from the dead, pressed them. From the rear and flank, Caesar's cavalry tore at them. Vercassivalonis's enormous army, those elite 60,000 killers, suddenly felt like a hunted beast. The formation crumbled. Confidence was replaced by the horror of encirclement. The Gauls began to look around. They saw the red spot of the cloak, which seemed to be everywhere at once. It seemed to them that there were thousands of Romans, that they were surrounded on all sides. Panic is a chain reaction. It is enough for one to waver, drop his shield and run, and dozens will run after him. And after dozens, thousands. And they ran. The great army that was supposed to crush Rome broke not from the force of weapons, but from the force of one man's will. Caesar, risking taking a javelin in the heart every second, won this psychological duel. He forced them to believe in their defeat before they were beaten. At that moment, amidst dust, blood, and the ringing of steel, the fate of Europe for the next 500 years was being decided. One man in a red cloak rewrote the script of inevitability. The Gauls, who just that morning saw themselves as masters of the situation, now turned into a disorderly crowd running from their own fear. The Roman machine, lubricated with blood and the genius of its creator, started working again, grinding up those who dared to challenge it. Fear is a virus, and on the battlefield of Alesia, it spread faster than a forest fire. When Gallic warriors saw Caesar's red cloak and the flashing blades of Roman cavalry in their rear, their collective mind failed. They didn't know the Romans were just a handful. In clouds of dust, in chaos and screams, it seemed to them that a new, fresh army had come to Caesar. They were surrounded. Illusion became reality, and reality, a death sentence. The great army of liberation, those 250,000 people who just an hour ago shook the earth with their roar, suddenly turned into a herd. The formation fell apart instantly. Chiefs lost control. No one listened to orders anymore. The only thought pulsating in hundreds of thousands of heads was one word: run. They dropped shields, spears, banners, everything that hindered speed. They turned around and rushed away from the Roman walls, knocking each other down, trampling the wounded, turning into an uncontrollable avalanche of flesh. And then Caesar let the dogs off the chain. The Roman cavalry, which had just performed a miracle by striking the flank, now switched to its favorite work: pursuit. This was no longer war, it was a hunt. A sporting discipline where targets cannot shoot back. Riders hacked into the crowd of runners like a knife into butter. They chopped backs, necks, heads. They didn't need to parry blows. They just needed to deliver them, methodically and rhythmically, until their arms got tired of holding the sword. The field beyond Alesia's walls turned into a slaughterhouse. The Romans took no prisoners. Why? Prisoners need to be fed, guarded. A dead Gaul is safe and requires no bread. The infantry, having broken out of the besieged camp, joined the massacre. Legionaries, intoxicated by miraculous salvation and thirst for revenge for weeks of fear and hunger, killed everyone they could reach. History tells us that the Romans pursued the runners until nightfall. They stopped only when horses began to fall from fatigue, and the fighters' arms could no longer lift weapons. The fields for many miles around were strewn with bodies. 74 banners were abandoned and trampled into the mud. The elite of the Gallic nation, the flower of their host, was cut down to the root. Those who survived scattered into the forests like frightened animals, having forever lost the will to resist. And then came silence. The next morning met Alesia with a deathly silence. There were no more shouts of stormers, no whistle of arrows, no tapping of pickaxes. Only the wind stirred the hair of the dead, lying in several layers in the trenches and on the ramparts. The smell was such that it could be cut with a knife. A mixture of iron, excrement, and beginning decay. Inside the fortress, on a high rock, Vercingetorix looked at this field of death. He saw the crows already starting their feast. He understood. It was all over. There is no hope. The relief army is destroyed. He remained alone with a handful of hungry, emaciated people in a stone cage. He could have ordered everyone to commit mass suicide. He could have tried to break through and die in battle. But he chose another path, the path of sacrifice. At a council of chiefs, gloomy as a funeral, he said, "I started this war not for myself, but for common freedom. But since fate is against us, I give myself to you. Kill me, or hand me over alive to the Romans to appease the victor." The Gauls sent ambassadors to Caesar. The proconsul's answer was short and harsh, like the crack of a whip. "Surrender weapons. Hand over the chiefs." no negotiations, no conditions. Complete, unconditional capitulation. Caesar ordered his curule chair placed right in front of the fortifications, before the face of the entire army. He sat there not as a general, but as a judge, as the living embodiment of Rome. Around him stood legionaries, dirty, indented armor, but victors. They looked at the gates of Alesia, and the gates opened. A rider rode out. It was Vercingetorix. Even in this moment, the moment of his absolute collapse, he remained true to himself. He put on his best, richest armor. His horse was adorned with silver and a golden harness. He rode out not like a beaten dog, but like a king walking to the scaffold. Plutarch describes this scene as if it were a mystical ritual. Vercingetorix didn't say a word. He put the horse into a gallop and rode around the seated Caesar in a circle. Once, twice. It was an eerie, silent dance. Then he stopped the horse right in front of the proconsul, jumped to the ground. The ring of metal tore the silence. Vercingetorix ripped off his helmet and threw it into the dust, took off his sword belt and hurled it at Caesar's feet, took off his armor, bearing his torso. He stood before his enemy unarmed, vulnerable, naked in his humanity. He sank to his knees and froze, awaiting the sentence. He looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his world. And what did he see? Respect? Compassion? No. He saw the cold, empty stare of a statue. Caesar didn't even stand up. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say a word of comfort. For him, this proud chief, this friend, as he had once called him, ceased to be a human being. He became a trophy, an inventory number in the list of loot. At Caesar's signal, legionaries approached, twisted Vercingetorix's arms behind his back, and dragged him away. The man who had almost brought Rome to its knees was dragged through the mud like a common thief. The great duel was over. Gaul died not with a roar, but with this dull sound of weapons falling to the ground. Ahead lay only the darkness of dungeons, years of waiting, and the cold loop of a garrote in the finale of a triumph. But that would be later. And now, the silence of the victor hung over Alesia, heavy, stifling, and absolute. When the dust of battle settles and the cries of the dying fall silent, it is not peace that enters the stage, but the accounting of war. Alesia didn't end the moment Vercingetorix threw down his sword. It just moved to another phase, the disposal phase. You might think the worst is behind, but look at what happens in the Roman camp the next day. This is no longer a military base. It is a giant slave market, a wholesale fair of human flesh. Tens of thousands of surviving Gauls, those very warriors who just yesterday furiously stormed the walls, now squat, shackled by one chain. They are sorted, their teeth examined, muscles felt. They are no longer considered enemies, they are considered merchandise. Caesar kept his word given to the legions. He promised them wealth, and he paid in full. Every soldier, from the last recruit to the primus pilus centurion, received one Gallic prisoner as personal property. Think about that. Overnight, 50,000 simple guys, many of whom came to the army as destitute peasants, became slave owners. A living human being cost money, big money. Selling his prisoner to dealers who, like vultures, flocked to the camp, a legionary received a sum equal to his salary for several years. It was here, amidst the jingling of coins and the weeping of slaves, that the most important and terrible transformation in the history of Rome took place. Look into the eyes of these soldiers. These are no longer citizens of the Republic, fulfilling their duty to the Senate and the people of Rome. This is a private army. This is a gang of millionaires, bound by a mutual guarantee of blood and gold. They look at Caesar, and whom do they see? They see not an appointed official whose term is expiring. They see a god. They see a father who feeds them, who gives them victories, who allows them to plunder and get rich. Who gave them all this? The Senate in distant Rome? No, the Senate only chatters and weaves intrigues. All this was given to them by Gaius Julius Caesar, the man in the red cloak. Alesia became the melting pot in which old loyalty burned away. The legionaries understood a simple truth. Their well-being depended on only one man. If Caesar falls, if he is put on trial in Rome, they will lose everything. Their wealth, their glory, their status, all this will disappear. And that means they have no other choice but to protect their leader. Against anyone. Against Gauls, against Germans, and against Rome itself, if required. Thus, a monster was born. In Rome, in the marble halls of the Senate, smart people felt the ground slipping from under their feet. News of the victory at Alesia caused not so much joy as cold horror. Cato and his supporters realized they had sent an ambitious politician to Gaul, and returning to them was a king, behind whose back stood 11 legions, loyal to him like dogs. These were wolves who had tasted human blood. They had gone through the hell of a siege. They had starved women and children. They had killed hundreds of thousands of people. They no longer had moral breaks. For the veterans of Alesia, civil war was not a taboo, but just another military operation. Vercingetorix, shackled in chains, went to prison to await his humiliating end. Strangulation by garrote 6 years later, during Caesar's triumph. But the real victim of this battle was not him. The real victim was the Roman Republic. It died not in the Senate, not from dagger blows on the Ides of March. It died here, in the mud of Gallic fields, amidst a double ring of fortifications. It was strangled by engineering genius and cynical calculation. It was here that a new formula of power was forged. Might makes right. The law is not what is written on paper, but whose side the legions are on. Caesar created a precedent that would echo through the centuries. He showed that efficiency is more important than morality, that victory writes off any sins, and that the army is an instrument not of the state, but of the commander. At the moment the last Gallic slave was sold under the hammer, the Rubicon had already been crossed. Physically, the legions still stood in Gaul, but mentally, they were already marching on Rome. Alesia is a bifurcation point. It is a scar on the body of history that will never heal. Here ended the era of romantic heroism, the era of noble barbarians and civic virtues. And the era of the empire began, an era where order is ensured by iron, where dissenters are ground into dust, and at the top of the pyramid stands a dictator leaning on the bayonets of his guard. Look back at these empty, wind-swept hills. Today flowers grow there and sheep graze. But if you listen closely, the earth still remembers. It remembers the heavy tread of caligae, the tapping of shovels, and that moment when civilization showed its true grin. We live in a world whose foundation was laid right there, on the bones of the defenders of Alesia, on the ruins of Gallic freedom, and on the fragments of old Roman honor. Caesar won, but the price of that victory was the soul of the Western world, which forever hardened in that great and terrible siege. The empire was born, and it was hungry.